Dear Excellencies, we are happy to introduce you Vladimir Kara-Murza, Russian politician, journalist, even film author, filmmaker and author. But before we will give floor to our excellent guest, there is organizers. And Elizabeth Bauer also will say some introductory words. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, I'm very much honored to greet you and to even especially to welcome our guest from Russia for tonight's discussion. And I think at the moment it's one of the most interesting discussion you can have, having someone from Moscow coming over here discussing what's going on over there and what things might happen in future. And as well, I'd like that everyone feel welcomed over here, and later on in the discussion, please ask your questions and not later on, because we want to give you your information you really like to have, and not only the ones we like to give you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So the rules of the game is following. In beginning, Vladimir will make some statement or short presentation, and then I will ask some questions, and then will be open floor for the audience as well, because I hope and I believe you will have questions. So I would like to start with one interesting analysis of Brian Whitmore, senior Russian analyst of Radio Free Europe. And he previously said that Vladimir Putin is like hybrid president. He works in two levels, and he has like two kind of influence from his historical experience from St. Petersburg time, like gangster capitalism time in St. Petersburg, and other influences, of course, from KGB. And Whitmore says that Putin established also a hybrid system in Russia. One system is for average people, which is probably in social sense better than in Yeltsin's time. Probably, maybe I'm wrong, but health system and other social spheres are working better than in Yeltsin time. But another is above. It's kleptocratic. There's a cycle of trust of Vladimir Putin. Those people who are around him, billionaires, or maybe some of them are just millionaires, but probably those are happy people. So, do you think it's correct understanding of Putin's system? Please explain your view. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andis, and I would like to first of all express my thanks to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for organizing and hosting this event, and also personally to Lolita Chigane, member of the Seima, and to Christianis Bush, who took all the burden of organizing this event tonight. I'm very grateful and honored to be here. Lolita, I just expressed thank you to you for organizing this and for inviting me here. To answer your question, Andis, I think, back when Putin became first prime minister, then acting president, and then president, although 17 years ago, some people, either who are really optimists or who were paid to pretend to be optimists, I don't know the reason, but they said, look, this guy worked for several years in Germany. He can't be that bad. He surely, knows what it's like to live in a Western country. He saw what it's like. Sure, he did work in Germany for several years. Unfortunately, it was the wrong Germany. It was the German Democratic Republic. And actually, the political system that we have in Russia today is very similar to what they had in the German Democratic Republic, because unlike the Soviet Union and some other Eastern Bloc countries, Romania and others, East Germany, as you all know, was not officially a one-party state. In fact, in the parliament of East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party didn't even formally have a majority. They had the Christian Democratic Union, they had the Liberal Democrats, they had the Peasant Party, was some other ones. Of course, this was all just on paper. And in real life, these were all obedient puppets and satellites of the ruling party. This is exactly what we have in Russia today. On paper, we have a parliament, we have elections, we have a multi-party system, we have several parties represented in the Duma on paper. But if you look on reality, if you look at all the key votes, for instance, in the Russian State Duma over the last many years, such as the vote on Crimea, the vote on the anti-orphan law, the vote on the Foreign Agents Law, the vote on censorship on the internet, and so on and so forth, you will see total and complete unanimity. So these so-called political parties are nothing but, departments of the Kremlin administration, effectively. So, those people who said that Putin took lessons from Germany were right, but it was East Germany. On the second part of your question about the social conditions, well, first of all, it's pretty easy to oversee an increase in the living standards when you have oil costing $150 a barrel, as Mr. Putin did until a few years ago, than $9 a barrel, which was the price of oil. And I think it should be remembered, when the last liberal government was in power in Russia, this was the government led by Sergei Kiriyenko and Boris Nemtsov back in 1998. Oil price was $9 a barrel. Under Putin, it rose up to 150. It's really not difficult. I think anybody, this table could have done it in that place. Having said that, there was of course a real increase in living standards, but if you're talking about the social sphere, which you mentioned, healthcare, education, those areas unfortunately are in continuing spiraling decline in our country. The demographic trends are very bad. The conditions, if you go, Moscow and St. Petersburg are, they live like average European cities in terms of standard of living. But if you go even 100 kilometers beyond, you will see a very different picture. And I go around Russia all the time. I travel in the regions a lot, in my capacity as the coordinator of the Open Russia movement. And I see these places. It's like two separate countries, if you take Moscow, St. Petersburg, and if you take the rest of Russia. So this image of supposed vast social and economic improvement, the vast majority of this image is the product of Putin's propaganda. And again, it's not difficult to create any image you like when you control every single national television channel. And for 80% of Russian citizens today, even despite the growth of the internet, 80% of Russian citizens today take their news from national television. This is their main source of news. And of course, the first target of Mr. Putin's regime back when he came into power 17 years ago was independent television. In his first 3 years in power, between 2000 and 2003, he shut down or took over every independent nationwide television channel in Russia, NTV, then TV6, and TVS, one by one. So everything after that is, they create the images they would like. So I hope I answered partly your question, and if I just say a couple of words, and then I'd be very happy to go into discussion, because I always prefer, I think that's the best way when it's live discussion and questions and answers. But first of all, I just want to once again say what an honor it is for me to be here, and I'm not just saying it because it's a polite thing to say, but coming to Latvia and speaking in Latvia always has very special meaning for me, and I try to take every opportunity I can to come here, because this is the land of my ancestors, and some of those ancestors played important and significant roles in the early formative years of the independent Republic of Latvia, almost a century ago. One of my great uncles, Andis was a close associate of President Čakste. He was a philanthropist, an agronomist, a publisher. Another of my great uncles, Gero Bisineks, was the first ambassador of Latvia to Great Britain in 1919 until 1923, and then he came back here, worked in the foreign ministry as a diplomat. Then he was director of the Ipoteko Bank. I was active in political life as well. He was arrested in 1940 after Soviet troops came in, transferred to Moscow, and executed in 1941. And when I was here in Riga a couple of years ago on another visit, my good friend Andrei Pildagovich, who's the State Secretary of the Foreign Ministry, took me around the Foreign Ministry building not too far from here and showed me the memorial plaques on the ground floor of the Foreign Ministry building, memorial plaques to Latvian diplomats who were killed by the Soviet and the Nazi regimes. And one of those names in those plaques was that of my great uncle, and I'm very grateful that this memory is being honored and respected and kept alive. And actually, one of my projects for next year, if I'm able to do that, is to try to commemorate the name of my great-grandfather, Vladimir Bisineks, another Latvian, who was he was a social democrat. He was exiled to Siberia under the Russian Empire in 1905, after the 1905 revolution, and then stayed in Russia, the Soviet Union rather, after 1917. He was arrested in 1937, that infamous year, in December. He was executed in September of 1938. And the way I want to commemorate him, of course, is not through any kind of state action, because that is impossible, needless to say, in today's Russia. But there is there is a very good public initiative which is supported and led by the Memorial Society, which is the organization founded by Andrei Sakharov a quarter century ago, which seeks to preserve the memory of those people in Russia who were killed under the communist regime. And Memorial has this initiative called The Last Address. It is when they go around and install small metal plaques on the houses where people were arrested in the 1930s and from where they were taken to their deaths. And that very simple small plaque, just name, dates of life and date of the arrest. And of course I know obviously the house, the address where my great-grandfather was arrested, so I'd really want to try and do that. And by the way, a couple of years ago I went to the KGB archive in Moscow to look at his file, which I'm still able to do even today, even under Putin. If you're a direct relative of somebody who was killed, I have to prove that I'm a relative, but then they give me access. So I was given access. I went to the KGB archive on Kuznetsky Most in Moscow, around the Lubyanka area. It's still there. And I got a look at the file. It's tiny, very, very small file, just two interrogation records, sentence, and that's it. And I think probably one of the most horrific things I saw in my life, and it was also so horrific because it was so casual and mundane and banal, it was the confirmation slip from the executioner. A small piece of paper, just 1/3 of A4 page, signed and dated with an actual name, which said, death sentence with regard to Mr. Bisenek's executed on this day at this time, signed, stamped, like, a receipt for payment or something. I saw that piece of paper. So anyway, so I'm very, very happy to be here again. And the discussion that we are taking part in tonight has been titled "The Faces of Russia," if my translation from Latvian is correct, right? That was the official title. And of course, for many years now, too many years, for much of the outside world, there's only been one face that has symbolized Russia and what's going on in Russia over the past many years. That is the face, of course, of Vladimir Putin, who's been in power for almost 17 years, soon about to break the record of Leonid Brezhnev, who was in power for 18. So there's now a whole new generation of young Russians who grew up without knowing any other political reality. I'm really the last generation to remember that, we could have a different president, we could have a different political system, we could have real elections in our country. People who are even 7 or 10 years younger than me, they don't remember that. And just to put things in context, the next presidential election in Russia is scheduled for 2018, a year and a half from now. And those people, those Russian citizens who will turn 18 and who will become voters and who will come to vote for the first time in that presidential election will have been born under Vladimir Putin. And that is a frightening thought. And for those of us who believe in a democratic and European Russia, this face, Mr. Putin's face, has represented and continues to represent everything that is wrong with our country today, both inside our borders and outside. On the inside, it's the dismantling of democratic institutions, the silencing of independent media, which we already mentioned, the political persecutions, the political prisoners, which we're having again in the dozens, the rigged elections, the rubber stamp parliament, the relentless government propaganda. Outside of our borders it's the complete disregard for international law. It is isolation from the rest of Europe. It is confrontation and conflict with the democratic world. It is support for dictators and extremist forces everywhere. But I think it is very important to distinguish, to keep that distinction between Russia and the Putin regime, because the regime itself likes to equate itself with Russia. In fact, Mr. Volodin, who's the new Speaker of the State Duma, until recently was the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Kremlin a couple of years ago, he said, "Without Putin, there will be no Russia." This is a direct quote. And, people in the Kremlin likes to accuse Western politicians of being Russophobes. But I can think of no bigger insult to say about a country with, with a rich history and great culture than to say that it will not exist without any one person, let alone this one. And unfortunately, too many people, even well-meaning people in the West, also often fall for this trap. And they talk about actions by Russia, the position of Russia, when what they mean, in fact, is the actions and position of the unelected, unaccountable authoritarian regime that we have in the Kremlin today. And I think it is very important to keep in mind this distinction and to make this distinction, because even though Mr. Putin's face is obviously the most prominent, and it looks at you from TV screens, from mugs, from T-shirts, from posters, from everywhere if you go to Russia, it is not the only face that we have in our country, thankfully. 2 years ago, in the autumn of 2014, soon after the start of Mr. Putin's aggression against Ukraine, we had a peace march in Moscow. to say no to this aggression that was supposedly being done in our name, in the name of Russian citizens. And I will never forget that day. It was just a sea of faces and flags, tens of thousands of people lining up, going down the Boulevard Ring from Pushkin Square to Andrei Sakharov Avenue. And for those of you who've been in Moscow know it's a pretty long time and a long way. And by the time those of us in the front had reached the ending point on Sakharov Avenue, people in the back on Pushkin Square, all the way up Boulevard Ring, were still lining up to go through metal detectors to begin the march. That's how many people there were on that day. And people were chanting, peace to Ukraine, freedom to Russia, no Putin, no war. And my personal favorite slogan, Dolой власть чекистов, down with Chekist power, that was the one shouted most loudly. These people, these Muscovites who came out to say no to Putin and his war, are also the faces of Russia. Even though you don't see them on state TV, you don't hear their voices in the current State Duma, and their votes are ignored in the rigged and manipulated elections that we have in our country. That march, that peace march, was led by Boris Nemtsov, who was the strongest, the most prominent, the most courageous opponent of Putin's authoritarianism, lawlessness, and corruption. He truly was the face of a different Russia, more hopeful Russia, more European Russia, more democratic Russia, who, if not for a twist of fate at the end of the 1990s, could well have become our president. And what a difference that could have made. He was, of course, a part of the very top of the official Russian establishment. He was a deputy prime minister, regional governor, parliamentary leader, and like so many others, he also could have chosen the easy and comfortable path of collaboration or silence or exile. But I knew him very well for many years, and he simply loved his country too much to stand idly by and do nothing and watch its future being destroyed by authoritarians and kleptocrats in the Kremlin. So he chose to stay, and he chose to fight. And he gave everything he had to that fight. And as you all well know, in the end, he gave it his life. In February of last year, he was shot, gunned down by 5 bullets in his back as he was walking home over the Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge, just 200 meters from the Kremlin wall, in what is probably the most secure perimeter, not just in Moscow, but in the whole of Europe. So we continue now without him, as best we can, to keep alive the principles of human rights, rule of law, freedom, democracy in Russia. Because there are many people in our country today who reject the hypocrisy, the authoritarianism, the corruption, the isolationism that have become the hallmarks of Putin's regime. Again, you don't see them on state TV, you don't hear them in parliament because they're not represented there, but they're very real, and I see them every week as I go around our country, east to west, and as we stage street rallies and political discussions, much like this one, and public events to try to break through that wall of coercion and propaganda that's been put up by the Kremlin and by Putin's regime, as we engage and support young opposition activists across the country who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, despite the high personal risk that carries in today's Russia. A month and a half ago, we held a so-called parliamentary election. Like all other elections under Vladimir Putin, this one had very little in common with a genuine democratic procedure. But nevertheless, the movement which I'm honored to represent, Open Russia, founded and led by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, supported about 24 young candidates in parliamentary districts across the country, from the shores of the Baltic Sea, just around the corner here in St. Petersburg, to the shores of Lake Baikal in the Irkutsk region in eastern Siberia. These are the new generation, the new faces of the democratic movement in Russia. And they took part in this election with our support, not to win, because that is impossible in today's conditions. We don't have real elections and haven't had for many years. But in order to show that an alternative exists, to show that our vision for a different Russia, a more democratic, a more European Russia, and to break this myth that's been carefully created by the Kremlin for many years, that there is no alternative to Putinism, and that is wrong. And we want to show that it is wrong. And also very importantly, so that they can, because they're all very young people, some of them are in mid to late 20s, so that they could gain some experience in political and public life that they will need in the future when things begin to change in Russia. And we're very happy that we were able to help them in their first steps in politics, and we certainly will continue doing that. And we will continue to build and sustain and strengthen as much as we can the movement, and to try to support independent media voices, especially in the regions, to try to keep alive this space for public discussions that is being destroyed by the current regime. And I think it's also very important, especially as we talk here in one of the European Union capitals, and to mention the foreign policy aspect. And I think history generally, but Russian history in particular, has shown a clear interdependence between domestic and foreign policy, between domestic repression and foreign aggression. And it's, if you think about it, it's very natural. I mean, there's no reason to expect a government that tramples on the rights of its own citizens or that breaks its own laws and its own constitution to then, for some reason, respect international law or respect the interests of its neighbors and behave like a responsible world citizen. There is no reason to expect it. And sure enough, this aggressive behavior, the propaganda, the information wars, the massive militarization that Putin's regime is engaged in, and not to mention the annexation of Crimea and other things, are a direct consequence of what he's been doing inside the country. And it works the other way, by the way, as well. 25 years ago, this is a 25th anniversary year of a very historic year, both for Latvia and for Russia, 1991. And if we think back to 1991, it may sound very strange today, but that is true. The Baltic independence movements at that time had no greater ally than democratic Russia and its leadership. In January 91, when Mr. Gorbachev sent tanks into Vilnius, and when you also had events here with the barricades in Riga with the OMON and so forth, 500,000 people went to Manezhny Square by the Kremlin walls in Moscow to say hands off the Baltic states. And Boris Yeltsin, who was at that time, he was still not president, he was Speaker of Parliament, but that was the head of state in the Russian SFSR at the time. He flew into Tallinn to sign mutual cooperation treaties with all the three Baltic republics that recognized their rights, their inalienable right to national independence. Not many people remember that, but that happened. And on the 24th of August 1991, just 2 days after defeating a hardline coup d'etat attempt in Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, who was by then already president, signed a decree recognizing the independence of all three Baltic states. He was the first leader to do that. He had no right to do it, by the way, because the Soviet Union was still in existence. He was only president of Russia as a constituent part of the Soviet Union. He had no right to recognize their independence, but he did anyway. And it took the United States 10 more days to do it, until September the 2nd. And I think it's also very important to remember that. So if we're talking about substantive shifts in the Kremlin's behavior abroad and in its foreign policy, I think it is very safe to say that the only substantive shift in that will come when the regime in the Kremlin, the current regime in the Kremlin, is replaced by a democratic government of Russia, which is, of course, our task. It is not for any outside actors to do. It is for Russian citizens alone to achieve this change. But what we do ask of our friends and neighbors here in the European Union is to stay true to your own values and to your own principles. First of all, I think it's important, what we already mentioned, to distinguish between Russia and the Kremlin regime. They're not one and the same. It's important to continue to engage with Russian society, with different voices inside Russian society, not just with those who represent the official government of the day. I think it's very important to counter the Kremlin's relentless propaganda machine and the information wars, and to counter this lying propaganda with actual genuine information, including, and this is relevant in my view for Baltic states, including in the Russian language. I'm very happy to learn recently that in the last year or so, both Latvia and Estonia have been expanding their national broadcasting in the Russian language, because I think unless you do that, you're just ceding the ground to Putin's propaganda machine. And trust me, it's well-funded and it's aggressive. So I think it's a very good sign that Russian language broadcasting in the Baltic states is being expanded. But I think it's also important, and maybe this is the most important thing of all, for the European Union to stop, to put a barrier to the export of corruption that Putin's kleptocrats are engaged in. You know, we can talk about many parallels that exist between the Putin regime today and the Soviet regime. We have political prisoners again. We have media censorship. We have no free and fair elections. And this list can continue for a long time. But for all these parallels, there's also one very big and very substantive difference. Because while they were putting dissidents in prison and shutting up dissent and doing what they were doing, members of the Soviet Politburo did not keep their money in Western banks. They did not send their kids and their families to live abroad. They did not buy yachts and real estate and go shopping in the European Union and United States. Leaders of the current regime do that, and the Kremlin-connected oligarchs do that. They want to behave inside Russia as if it was a third world dictatorship, but they want to use all the privileges that the free world has to offer for themselves and for their families. And I think this double standard and this hypocrisy has to stop. And I think it's a very simple principle that those who trample on the most basic norms of the free world should not enjoy the privileges that the free world has to offer. It's as simple as that. And if there's anything we would ask of our friends and neighbors here in the European Union, is to put a stop to this double standard, to put a stop to this hypocrisy, and to tell those crooks and those abusers that they're not welcome here. 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, the United States passed a groundbreaking law. It was called the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which established for the first time these principles of applying sanctions not against the country, not even against the government, but against specific individuals involved in corruption and human rights abuse, by telling them that those people will no longer be allowed to receive US visas and to use the US banks and US financial system. Unfortunately, in those almost 4 years that have passed since the US Magnitsky Law, not a single European Union country has followed suit, not a single one. Boris Nemtsov, who was very actively involved in this campaign in support of the Magnitsky Act in the US, called it the most pro-Russian law in the history of any foreign parliament. And I think he was absolutely right, because it's a law that targets those who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. 2 years ago, here at the Latvian parliament, I took part in a hearing about a possible introduction of a Magnitsky-type law here. There was, and I see many friends here in this room who were part of those hearings in the Latvian parliament, and there was significant support in the Latvian parliament for this initiative. Unfortunately, it's been 2 years, even more, 2.5 years, and these words have not been followed by action. And it is my sincere hope that these words will be followed by action, and that Latvia will become, as we hoped 2.5 years ago, the first country in the European Union to tell those crooks, those abusers, and those corrupt officials that they will not be welcome here anymore. And I think that would be, as Boris Nemtsov said, a very pro-Russian measure, and that would be the best message of support from our friends and neighbors in the European Union to those of us who are continuing to struggle for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Russia. Thank you so much once again, and I'm sorry I went on for too long, but I'll be very happy.
No, it's not too long. We are here because of you, so it's okay. And probably you already answered at least 5 questions from my list.
I didn't see them in advance.
No, it's good because you make my job easier. Why not? I'm here more like moderator, so discussion will be with the audience. We have here distinguished people who probably will have questions. And thank you for all you said. Just to make an illustration to what you said about these problems in social sphere, I took some data from Levada Center, and there was in August this year, one of the questions, please indicate what more than anything else currently makes your family life difficult. So, and the first one, low income, lack of money, 61%. Second one, everyday problems, 21%. And what's interesting for our discussion, poor health, difficulty of obtaining medical treatment, 19%. So there are other, this long list, but as you said, no, but
so much for the so-called social improvement.
Yeah, my question is, but when we will look to the answers of popularity of Vladimir Putin, we will find high numbers. So why? My question is why average people do not link this problem, like social problems, with Vladimir Putin? When we saw this, his this public, not interview, but communication with the society. Yes, exactly. Direct line, probably. Yes, we can translate it. And there was just tragic and comic in the one time. The questions was about roads in Omsk and salaries somewhere in the far east. And those problems were because of Vladimir Putin's system. And of course, he resolved it. And there was a report from journalists several days after this direct line that everything was resolved. Those workers in the Far East, some fishing company received salaries. They repaired the road in Omsk. So everything said, but the problem is, at least part of problem is because of Putin. But why there is no link? I mean, in the minds of the average people.
Sure. Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It was a road in Omsk, and there was another question. A little girl called from Primoria region in Vladivostok and asked Putin to put a children's playground, near their house. And of course, they then touted that they did it. But these Potemkin villages are actually, in fact, show that the system is broken, because you could not rule the world's largest country that stretches across 9 time zones from Eastern Europe to the Far East like this, The only reason, I think, or the major reason, that Russia didn't break up in the 1990s when we had severe social and economic problems, much worse than now, is because we had a flexible and democratic system. Because we had genuine federalism back then, with local governments having enough authority of their own and being elected, which is very important. We had a genuine parliament, and there was a way to channel these disagreements and these disputes into democratic institutions, which does not exist today. So if there is an economic collapse or economic catastrophe tomorrow, nobody can say what's going to happen. So this shows a completely broken system, and it's a symbol of everything that's wrong with the system built by Vladimir Putin, the system that is basically depending on one person, with one person making all decisions, even worse than in the Soviet times, if there can be such thing as worse than Soviet times, because the Politburo had at least a few people and they did discuss something. Now we have one person making all decisions. But on your question about the so-called popularity of Mr. Putin, I just want to say straight away, I think it's completely meaningless to talk about opinion polls in an authoritarian system. Imagine you sit in your house and you get a phone call, or even worse, a knock at the door from somebody you don't know. And you know everything that's going on in the country. You know that opponents of the Kremlin are denounced as foreign agents and traitors. You know that people are in prison for nothing else but expressing their political views. You know that the opposition is persecuted, that everything, everything is going on in the country. And you get a knock on your door and some person you don't know asks you, do you support Putin or not? What are you going to say?
Yes, of course.
This is meaningless.
I do.
So even you would say that, right? So these 86 or 89 or 102, however many percent they say they have of support, it's bogus. And I don't think we should be wasting time even discussing this. I think a much better indicator of the position of this regime is its own behavior. A government that has 86 or even 66% support wouldn't need to rig elections. It wouldn't need to keep the opposition from the ballot. It would need to break up peaceful demonstrators with riot police and military force. It wouldn't need to try to break up events, even such as this. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we at the Open Russia movement try to go around the country organizing, similar discussions, debates, and every single time there are police buses arriving, there's a siren in the building, they say there's a bomb, people start being arrested, people start being dead. Just a discussion. Sometimes I remember last year I took Professor Andrei Zubov, who is a very prominent Russian historian, used to be professor at MGIMO, which is the Russian Foreign Ministry's diplomatic academy. And 2 years ago, after he wrote an op-ed comparing Putin's annexation of Crimea to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland, he was fired from MGIMO, but that doesn't make him any less, obviously, of a historian. He's a very prominent professor of Russian history. I took him to Kazan last year in Tatarstan, and his lecture was about the early Romanovs, the mid-17th century, and we had the same treatment with the police. So it's anything that's independent, that's out of their control, that they try to destroy and keep down. And that's not the behavior of a government that is strong and popular. That's the behavior of a regime that is weak and unsure of itself. And I think that's a much better indicator than the bogus numbers they come up with in those opinion polls.
Thank you. Another illustration to what you said about Russian foreign policy. You mentioned you use the word isolation, and there is another question from Levada. Does it worry you that Russia has become more and more isolated from the West over the past year? And the answers are greatly 6%, somewhat 23%, not much 37%, and not at all 25%. So when we put together not much and not at all is 62%. So once again, I believe this semi-isolation, not total isolation, but let's say semi-isolation of Russia, it makes some influence on the economical system in Russia. I mean, there is a shortage of finances, and there is a lack of opportunities to get credits in the Western banks for the Russian businessmen. So this isolation makes some problems, but once again, 62% doesn't see it, do not see it.
Well, first of all, I'll repeat the point about opinion polls generally, and the fact that even by those figures, 30% of Russians dare to say publicly and openly to an opinion poll that they reject this isolation. That's a pretty good result, I would say, given the current conditions. But in terms of sanctions, actually the worst sanctions against the Russian people were imposed not by the EU or the US, but by Vladimir Putin. He's called counter-sanctions in August 2014, when he banned the imports of food products and other products from European Union, the US, Canada, other Western countries. And like back in bad old Soviet days, now when I go back to Moscow, let's say from here, I would stock up with cheese and sausage like we used to do 25 years ago, because you can't get them, because they're sanctioned by Putin, not by any outside actors, outside forces. So it's probably even better to describe it as self-isolation than isolation. But this, of course, is accompanied by a relentless and unceasing and unyielding propaganda in the same direction. If you watch Russian state TV, which I don't do because I value my nervous system, but if you do...
I do.
Well, I'm really sorry.
My wife suffers because I become emotional.
Right.
Sometimes.
Well, I can understand. I don't even have a TV in my home, but so you know what kind of stuff they're saying. They're saying that they can turn the U.S. into radioactive ash, that Europe is in decline and will soon collapse, that it's becoming decadent, that the only true beacon of moral values is Vladimir Putin. That's preposterous. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's what they actually are saying. And if you do this day after day, year after year, with no alternative access to information for people, unfortunately, a lot of people will start believing that. Not everybody. And again, there are many people who are immune to this, but unfortunately, some people are not. So, of course, inevitably, we'll be starting to see figures like this.
Yeah, and I will continue with Levada because I remember that was maybe 6 months ago or something. There was a question about foreign languages knowledge among Russians, I mean, those who are living inside of Russia. And that was a surprise for me. Only around, I don't remember the exact number, but that was around 15% answered that they can speak more or less one foreign language, more or less, более или менее in Russian. So it's probably also one of the problem why they are not getting another views from alternative informational sources. But I agree about Russian TV channels, and
Can you see them here?
Yeah, sure. Yes, we have in the cable packages, and I'm watching.
Dmitry Kiselyov here.
Yes, he's my star, my personal star, as a most bold propagandistic man from Russia. So, but I'm watching because I'm studying Russia. Otherwise, probably I would not torture myself. So, my last question before I'll give opportunity to audience also to raise questions is about this new security ministry. What do you think? What kind of impact that will have? And also this new law. Actually, there was 2 laws of Irina Yarovaya about the internet and controlling of internet. So, why Ministry of Security? They already, Putin already established this National Guard with Viktor Zolotov in charge. So what does it mean? How do you read it?
First of all, I think a significant part of this is symbolic, because, of course, as you know, they're proposing to name it the MGB. And I don't need to tell you in Latvia here what is MGB. It's not even KGB, it's Stalin time, right? It's pre-1953, it was called MGB. So that's what they're proposing. And one of the earliest things that Mr. Putin did. When people ask me when I understood, who Vladimir Putin really is, I can always name the precise date, and people are always puzzled. How can you name the date? But I can explain why I can name the date, because it was December the 20th, 1999. He was still prime minister. Yeltsin was still president. This is the last 10 days of Yeltsin's presidency. On that day, Putin did 3 things. He opened a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov on the KGB building on Lubyanka Square in Moscow. Andropov was, of course, the KGB chairman who established the 5th Directorate, charged with suppressing dissent, who introduced the horrid practice of punitive psychiatry when dissidents were declared to be mentally insane and sent to asylums and so on and so forth. So Putin opened a memorial plaque to this guy. He raised a glass at the Moscow White House, the government building, to Joseph Stalin, because that is Stalin's birthday, December the 20th, and the only person, he was meeting with leaders of the parliamentary parties, and Grigory Yavlinsky, leader of Yabloko, the Liberal Party, was the only one who refused to put down his glass and walked out. All the rest were fine with it. And the third thing he did on that same day, just one day, the 20th of December is, of course, the Chekist Day, the day of the founding of the KGB, the Cheka, which is still celebrated by this regime as a holiday. He spoke at an event with KGB veterans that evening, and he said a phrase, and everybody laughed because everybody thought, how funny, what a joke this is. He said, "I can report to you," he told them, this is a room full of KGB veterans, so I can report to you that a group of undercover KGB operatives sent to work in the Russian government have fulfilled their mission. And everybody started laughing and clapping. Of course, now we know that there's nothing joking in this joke at all. He did all these things on one day. So for me personally, and I don't claim to be early in this because I know many people who understood much earlier who Vladimir Putin really was. For me, that was December the 20th, 1999. But one of his earliest things also when he became president in 2000 was to reinstate the Stalinist national anthem, the music by Alexandrov. And of course, people also, why is he bothering? People ask at the time, why is he bothering to do this? And what difference does it make? But no, it does make a difference for them. For them, that's a symbol. It's like it's a symbol that no one now observes August 22nd in Russia as a public holiday, which it was in the 90s, which is the victory against the communist coup d'etat in 1991. It was a public holiday established by President Yeltsin. It's not observed since the early 2000s, not in any way at all. So these things are symbolic, and there are messages that he's sending to people, both his own and to us, if you will. So the MGB is, I think it's one of those, because you're absolutely right, there's no practical reason. I mean, they have everything concentrated already. They have the KGB restored de facto, just without the name. So give it the name, that's a symbolic thing. So I think that's the main reason they're doing this.
Yeah, thank you. So there is an opportunity to ask questions, please. Yes. Who will? No one. Me. So switched on.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Valdis Liepiņš. I'm the chairman of the board of Transparency International Latvia. And we were working together with Vladimir on presenting Magnitsky's book in the Latvian parliament. I can boast about the fact that I've seen Putin's picture on toilet paper. You didn't mention that. I can give you a sample.
That'd be nice, thank you.
Not used. I have two questions in one, basically. What do you think is Putin's main weakness, and what is Russia's main threat, apart from Putin?
What do you mean Russia's main threat? Main threat to Russia?
Main threat to Russia, apart from Putin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, and I should mention also that Valdis is former member of the Latvian Parliament, member of the International Magnitsky Law Board, and a good friend. It's great to see you here. On your questions, I think the biggest threat to Vladimir Putin, you said, right? The biggest threat to his system?
No. What is Putin's biggest weakness?
Weakness, right. Okay.
And then what is the biggest threat to Russia, apart from Putin?
Okay. I think his biggest weakness is the system he built himself. When everything depends on one person, when there is no communication of any kind with society, and especially given it's been so many years already, you can see by some of their actions that they just completely lost touch with reality. They're starting to believe their own propaganda. They're starting to believe Dmitry Kiselyov. I think that's the worst possible thing, the biggest possible weakness you can have. So they're becoming the hostages of their own system, of their own regime. And just recall 5 years ago when we suddenly had mass protests in the middle of Moscow on Bolotnaya Square and Sakharov Avenue. 120,000 people stood across the river from the Kremlin demanding Putin's resignation. They were genuinely shocked. I mean, if you remember, they went, well, not into hiding, but they went silent for a few days. The regime was nowhere to be found. It's as if, and the TV changed like this, by the way, also. The coverage on state TV, suddenly they began showing the protest, and I wouldn't say in favorable, but in a neutral light, and they were panicking because they didn't know what to do, because they couldn't foresee it, because they began, already by then, they began to believe their own propaganda, that they do have the 86 or 100%, that nobody is against them. And suddenly they saw a sea of faces across the Kremlin, and it happened like that. And that's one thing we know about Russian history, that things happen quickly and unexpectedly. And it's not just for them, it's for us too. If somebody told me 2 weeks before Bolotnaya that we'll have 100,000 people in the center of Moscow demanding Putin's resignation, I would say, that person is not right in the head, but we did. Or in August 91, if somebody said, a month before the coup, that there wouldn't be a Soviet regime anymore in a month's time again. But it happened, both of them happened. So I think that's the biggest weakness. They're beginning to live in their own bubble. They're beginning to be completely detached from reality, and that's going to be the end of them. And it's going to be, again, sudden, quick, and unexpected. This is why we're doing what we're doing as Open Russia and my other colleagues in the opposition. We're beginning to prepare now, because when this happens, it'll be too late to start preparing. Like we found out in 91. Nobody was ready, and we're seeing the consequences. So I think we have to start getting ready now. As fantastic as it sounds today, that Putin's regime will be gone and there will be a democratic transition in Russia. It will happen, and we need to start getting ready for it. This is what we're doing. The biggest threat to Russia, apart from Putin, I think are apathy and hopelessness. These were the two biggest victors in the so-called parliamentary election we had in September, because most people simply didn't go. Because in the 17 years of Putin's regime, people have been accustomed to the fact that their votes mean nothing, that everything will be decided anyway, so the people didn't go. I voted about 3 p.m. in my polling station in Moscow. I was alone, and when I signed, for the ballot paper on the book, there was maybe one other signature out of the whole big page of several apartments and houses, and even officially, the turnout in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are usually the most politically active parts of our country, was around 30%. So more than 2/3 of people simply didn't go, and we can certainly understand why. But I think this apathy and this hopelessness are the biggest threats to Russia after Putin and what Putin is doing to our country. And it is against the apathy and hopelessness that we have to fight as well as against the Putin regime. And we're trying our best to do that.
I don't believe that would be the case, because that really works to Putin's advantage. So really the apathy and the hopelessness, what are the consequences? Those are the threats. And how do you see the consequences of this on Russia?
Sure, but that's how I understood your question. What are the threats to Russia, not to Putin? And these are
threats to Russia. In fact, this would be a help to Putin, that the population is
of course
sort of hopeless,
so we have to
and
challenge
so on.
that as well as him.
Yeah, but the weakness to Russia, or the threat to Russia, is not just the apathy. It is what happens after that. What are the consequences of this apathy? How is that a threat to Russia? That's what I was really getting at.
Right. No, and I think this is probably true for many countries, not just for Russia, but I think the vast majority of people, and this goes back to what we were talking about, the supposed support for Putin, I think the vast majority of people simply don't care. They're simply either not interested, or they think it's too dangerous, or they just don't care. So we have a small part that is actively backing Putin, a small part, a little smaller, but not much smaller, that is actively against, like us, and the rest just don't care. And it's a question of dealing with that massive swamp of people who don't care in order to effect change. But also, as a historian by training, I know that change is never affected by the majority. It's always affected by small, dedicated groups of people that are prepared to stand up for what they believe in, despite the risk. And I think once we have that critical mass of people in Russia, this is when things will start changing.
Yeah, what is interesting that this apathy and alienation from governments is one of the messages of Russian propaganda as well. They are spreading outside of Russia, because the aim is just to make people think that everything is settled everything is decided by elites. That means I cannot do anything.
Sure,
so.
Your vote is meaningless. And also, another part of the propaganda is they're saying that everybody's like that. Yes. So as you know, because you watch these guys, the message is that, the West says they're democratic, but they're lying. It's just the same. It's just as corrupt. This is why they're so happy about Trump, by the way. They're saying it's just the same. Look at them. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about this propaganda, the external propaganda, we talked about a minute ago about the importance, in my view, why it is important to counteract this propaganda with information, including in the Russian language here in the Baltic states. For me, the biggest argument is the results of the State Duma election in September among those Russians who voted in Latvia, Russian citizens who reside in Latvia. Even according to the official results, with everything that we've said, Putin's party, United Russia, got 54% of the vote in Russia. 54% officially. This is obviously a highly inflated figure, but that's the official number. In St. Petersburg, they got 39%. In Moscow, 38% officially. In Latvia, among Russians who voted here, Putin's party got 75% of the vote. And that's all you need to know about the effectiveness of the propaganda and the importance, in my view, of countering it.
Because those who are not traveling, locals, Russian citizens who are residing here in Latvia, those who are not traveling to Russia, they have only Tele-Russia, Tele-Putin and Tele-Medvedev.
I always say when I'm speaking, let's say at a hearing in the European Parliament, and there was this wonderful representative of Latvia in the previous European Parliament called Mr. Mirsky, who would appear at every time that we Russian opposition members would arrive, and he would give his prepared stump speech in support of Putin, and it would sound to me like not even at a United Russia, but at an LDPR meeting, which is Zhirinovsky's party. That's how he would speak. But every time I have people, when we speak at international forums in the West, coming and defending Putin, I always want to say to them just one thing: welcome. I live in Moscow. Welcome. Try to spend at least 2 months there. We'll see how you talk after that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please, lady. And then
Hello, good evening. My name is Ilza Tamanis, and I just represent Ilza Tamanis, nothing more than that.
it's good enough.
Yes. I would like to ask you, or rather to say that Putin very often presents the West, especially Europe and America, as being the great evil, which is trying to suppress Russia. But in actual fact, should not Mr. Putin be more concerned about people such as Mr. Kadyrov and some of the Central Caucasus nations that equally may be presenting a problem to him, or is that not the case?
Thank you very much. And that's a really important question. I would rephrase slightly, I would say that Russia should definitely, and the Russian society and Russian people should definitely be worried about people like Kadyrov, and many people are. For Putin, Kadyrov is his favorite attack dog. He's his loyal servant. He's an official appointed by Putin. For the past few years, he served in the front lines of the Kremlin's attack against us, against the democratic opposition. It was Kadyrov who organized a mass rally in Grozny a few months ago, saying, you know, that there's enemies of Putin are enemies of Russia. This is the fifth column. These are national traitors. These are foreign agents. They should be dealt with. It was Mr. Kadyrov who a few months ago showed a picture of Mikhail Kasyanov, former Russian Prime Minister, and myself, with a sniper rifle superimposed on it, you know, the goal, with the message, those who haven't understood will understand. It is Mr. Kadyrov's people who are now on trial at the Moscow District Military Court for the murder of opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. All the links lead to Kadyrov's regime, or at least through it. We don't know how high it leads, but definitely leads up to there. Despite this fact, and despite the numerous requests by Boris Nemtsov's family to question Kadyrov in relation to the assassination, he has not been questioned even once. Investigators have been unable to even go to Chechnya to conduct, you know, the investigation. Investigators have been twice prevented by General Alexander Bastrykin personally, the head of the Russian Investigative Committee and Mr. Putin's old university friend. He twice blocked their attempts to name one of Kadyrov's associate, Gereimeyev, as an organizer of the crime. He blocked it twice personally. So according to the official documents that have gone into court now, prepared by the Russian Investigative Committee, the assassination of the leader of the Russian opposition 200 meters from the Kremlin wall, as I said, probably the most secure location in the whole of Europe, was masterminded by a driver. This is the official version that is going on trial as we speak. And so this is the role of Kadyrov. And I think, by the way, that there's a cruel, bitter and a cruel irony in the fact that it is Chechens who are serving as Putin's attack dogs against Russian Democrats, given the history, and given that 2 decades ago, when Putin was coming to power, in the context of carpet bombings of Chechen towns and cities, it was Russian Democrats who defended the Chechens against Putin. And it was Boris Nemtsov who collected 1 million signatures against the war in Chechnya in January 1996 and brought it to President Yeltsin's table while being a serving regional governor. And the fact that those accused of his murder are all Chechens, I think that's a horrible and that's a cruel irony. But I think more generally, I would answer your question with the fact that, in my view and in the view of many people in Russia, that if there is a genuine external threat to our country, it comes from our southeastern borders with China, not with our European borders. I think we have, first of all, I think it's not a question of even me thinking, it's a fact. Russia is a European country. We have common culture, common heritage with our friends and neighbors in Europe. There is no threat coming from there. We have stable democratic countries to our west. We have communist China to our east, whose population density vastly exceeds, you know, the population density of our side of the border. You have maps in some Chinese schools already showing Eastern Siberia as temporarily Russian territory in the future, meaning, you know, whatever you want to make of it. But of course, what Putin is doing, he's presenting Europe and the West as the enemy, while making deals with China, like the recent pipeline project, that is actually detrimental to Russian budget, and in my view, detrimental to long-term Russian national interests. But of course, the important thing to remember all the time is that they don't care about Russian national interests, long-term Russian national interests. They don't care. All they care about is their own pockets. And all they care about is, you know, now, while they're in power. What happens after, they don't care.
Exactly what Kadyrov is concerned about, because, of course, Kadyrov is getting an awful lot of money from Vladimir Putin. And if that money dries up, as indeed, you know, if you look at the economy of Russia, the economy is only about the size of the Dutch or the Spanish economy.
Spain, right.
And given the amount of military adventurism that is going on at the moment, whether it's in the Baltic Sea or in the Arab countries, the cost of all of that to Russia must be enormous. So the strains on the purse must be huge. A large part of the purse, or not a large part, but a considerable part of the purse is going to Kadyrov, who's very happy to whiz around in endless black cars. Once that tap of money has been turned off, is Mr. Kadyrov likely to be as subservient and useful to Putin then, or is he going to look for other sources of revenue?
Well, first of all, Chechnya is indeed a giant black hole in the Russian budget. Billions of rubles that go there and disappear without trace every single year. And I would say this, I think that when the moment comes when we do have political change in our country and when this regime is gone and when there's a new transitional democratic government in Russia, we're going to have a very big problem with the North Caucasus and with Chechnya and with Kadyrov in particular. Very, very big problem. In fact, going back to what I said a minute ago about them serving as attack dogs, I remember in that protest winter of 2011-2012 when we had those mass protests against Putin in Moscow, and other places also, but Moscow is obviously the most important one, being the capital. I remember we had a meeting of the organizing committee before one of the rallies, and one of the members walked in. He was a member of the Duma at the time, a former KGB guy. He said, I got a phone call from some of my old colleagues, and they just warned me, just because they have good personal relations. They said, we just want to let you know, there are about 20,000 armed Kadyrovites being summoned into Moscow on that day, because Putin knows that Russian police is not going to shoot in unarmed Russian people on the streets of Moscow. The Kadyrovites, they don't care. They will. And this is why they were bringing them in. So I think when changes start happening in our country, we will have a big problem with the Chechnya and the North Caucasus, and that problem was single-handedly created by Putin himself.
I like what you said about China. Sorry, I will manage. I like what... Yes, it works. Once again, I liked what you said about China, because I was yesterday in one security conference in Estonia, and I told the same, quite the same thing you said, because if you look to the newest national security strategy of Russia, there is no mention China, maybe one or two sentences, that's it. All evil, of course, comes from West in general and from NATO in particular. So, but it's interesting, because why they can say that NATO is a threat, because NATO is not real threat. You can say what you want. Imagine what would happen if officials of Russia would write down in this strategy that China is concerned of Russia. So in this, it's just incredible. So there was a question, lady in first line.
My name is Sabine. Do you hear me?
I can.
Okay, that's the most important, I guess.
No, probably it's necessary because there is a streaming.
Okay, sorry.
Because of,
It's working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Sabine Koshileva, and I'm working as an editor-in-chief at one of the Latvian news portals, so I would like to ask a simple question about the propaganda, of course. Yeah, we all know that we cannot trust the Russian media, and we cannot use it in our news. Like you said in the beginning, that the Putin regime is controlling all of the television channels and other media are taking information from them. Is there really a single reliable media source in the whole country that would show this other face of Russia? Is the situation that bad? Really?
No, of course there is. And I actually learned just yesterday that you here in Latvia have a big advantage over me living in Moscow, that, for instance, you can see the Dost television channel in a cable here. I cannot, because as you know, after the question about the blockade of Leningrad to you, and that was just a pretext, but after that, Dost was kicked out of every single satellite and cable provider, so I can only watch it on the internet by subscription. You can see it in cable. So Dost is definitely, I mean, we have a dwindling number of honest, independent media outlets, and just literally in the last couple of months, another major one was destroyed. This is RBC, the media holding which belongs to Mikhail Prokhorov, one of the oligarchs who is loyal to the Kremlin, but nevertheless the media outlet was a high-quality one, independent one, and they dared to go into issues and fields that no other big media outlet would dare to go, like the Panama offshore scandal. They're the one who broke the story about Roldugin, Putin's personal friend, the cellist, with $2 billion. There was a joke about this in Moscow in the spring that everybody thought that Paul McCartney was the world's richest musician. That's before we knew about Sergei Raldugin. But anyway, they carried this story, and a few days after that, the editor-in-chief was fired, the whole editorial board was fired, they were taken under control. So there is a dwindling, constantly shrinking number of reliable independent media sources in Russia, but there still are some. I would, if you'd like me to name them, this is not in terms of promotion. I have no affiliation with any of them, but just as a consumer of information, as a citizen, as somebody living in Moscow, what I would use as a source of information, of course, are several online publications like newsru.com. That's pretty reliable in my view and independent. In terms of broadcast, it would be Dost, although, as I mentioned, I cannot actually watch it, but you can hear. It would be, of course, Echo Moskvy, which is majority owned by Gazprom, but nevertheless it does maintain an editorial policy line, partly because the Kremlin needs some kind of a window still for some reasons, but you know, in this particular case, that's a good thing because it's still a platform that gives, you know, voices to us, let's say. They do allow opposition on the air, so Echo Moskvy will be another one. Of course, Radio Liberty, I mean, technically it's a US media publication, but it's based in Moscow, the Russian service, and it's in Russian, so I would count it as a Russian media publication. In terms of print, we still have Novaya Gazeta, which was Anna Politkovskaya's newspaper, that's still published 3 times a week. We still have Vedomosti, although there are some moves against that as well now in the last few weeks. As I mentioned, RBK was destroyed. Kommersant is not really the same as it was. So really, I think we can count them on the fingers of one hand, but they're still there. And so it still is possible to get objective news in Russia.
But what about the society? Does it distinguish like the reliable sources from the bad ones, or it's just media for them?
Unfortunately, again, it's what we said a few minutes ago in response to Valdis's question, that this apathy and the attitude of just not caring for the vast majority of people, they don't really, I mean, they're not even trying to distinguish. It's not they don't pose that question to themselves. Of course, people who are more civically conscious and politically active, people in the big cities, especially like Moscow and St. Petersburg, of course they do distinguish, and they do watch or listen or read, whatever the form is, those independent media outlets. And this is why, for example, even today, even given everything that I've said about current Russian elections, you still see very different election results in Moscow as compared, for instance, to the whole of Russia. As I mentioned, Putin's party only got 38% officially. Putin didn't even get 50% in the 2012 presidential election last time he ran. Even officially, he couldn't get over 50% in Moscow. So, and again, that's a very interesting thing to see what an impact access to alternative sources of information have. And this goes back to our conversation about the opinion polls and opinions of Russian society. When Russian citizens have access to genuine information as opposed to lying propaganda, they make different choices. And this is why the regime is so afraid of access to information. This is why they tolerate small pockets of independent media, but not large nationwide outlets like the old NTV, which was the biggest independent TV channel back in the 90s and in early 2000s. You know, its daily audience was about 100 million people. That's most of Russia. Of course, they couldn't tolerate that. Echo Moskvy, the combined audience is about, just to put things in context, right? It's about 3 million people in a country of 145 million. That's the scale, actually. So they could not tolerate the big ones. They tolerate small ones for now. We'll see what happens.
Thank you. So no. Paul, there was a. Okay. I'm sorry. You will have opportunity here, sir, and Mr. in the third row. Yes. And then Pauls, and then you, Rasmus Karlin.
Good evening. My name is Gunts Merzinch. I used to be a member of parliament in Latvia. The question I wanted to ask is that we see, of course, that Putin has annexed Crimea. He's entered part of the Ukraine. And, of course, he's also demonstrating the military might in Syria at the moment. And Russia has also gone so far as to change its military doctrine and indicated that they could contemplate first use of nuclear weapons. Now, we're not very far from the Russian border here. And my question really is, to what extent should we or should we expect some other sort of military adventures by Russia that we should be concerned about?
Okay, thanks for the question.
Let's make a collection, probably.
Of course.
And Pauls Rauceps now, and then Rasmus Karlin.
Thank you, Paul Sarautsevs. I'm a journalist here. Actually, that was my question, except I had a an additional question. There's been a notable ratcheting up of bellicose rhetoric by Kremlin media over the last month. We've seen the Iskander missiles move to Kaliningrad, also seen as a potentially aggressive measure. What do you think the goal of this particular policy is right now for the Putin regime?
Thank you, and let's have a third one. There was before? Okay, thank you.
Okay, hello, my name is Maris Rupanis, I represent this beautiful evening. And the question will be a little bit more going into specificalities. Of recent, we've seen quite a lot of reshuffles in the top elites in Russia, for example, Ivanov resigning and Volodin being removed to State Duma. The thing is, why it was necessary, this is the first question. The second question is, why Kiriyenko in those conditions? Does it mean trying to turn towards the West, trying to utilize the old contacts in the West, or why? Thank you.
Okay, now, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll try to go in the order. Thanks a lot for the question, except I would always ask this, please don't say Russia. It's the Kremlin regime that's doing it. We're Russians too, we're not responsible. So, yes, yeah, or whatever. There are other ways of saying it, but I would also ask people to make this distinction. I think, over the last few years we've had several reasons, many reasons I should say, to doubt the, should I say, mental state of those who occupy the Kremlin today. But I still don't think they would go as far as to violate a border of a NATO member state. At least today I don't think they will go so far. That doesn't mean to say that they're not going to employ so-called hybrid methods. Actually, just like in Eastern Ukraine, there is no, if you listen to Russian state TV, there is no war that Putin is conducting in Ukraine. It's all internal squabbles as a result of a fascist junta having taken over in Kiev. That's what it is. And by the way, even opinion polls, given everything we've said about them and the limitations, even opinion polls show that more than 70% of Russian citizens are against a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is why the Kremlin TV is doing so much to hide the fact that it's going on. And that is happening. So, the hybrid measures like the aggressive propaganda, which they're already doing, like attempts to influence political forces inside your own country. They've been known to do it in other countries, and we know it's actually open information that the Kremlin has helped to finance the National Front in France, the far-right organization. There's been a big loan taken out by the National Front through a Czech-based Kremlin-connected bank. I think it was for 7 or 9 million euros or something. And this is just open information, and we can only guess about the extent to which this is going on. And again, when I come to the European Parliament and listen to people like Alexander Mirsky speaking, I have questions in my mind whether he actually does it because he believes it, or maybe there are other reasons. But the Kremlin has been known to influence, try to work, within the systems of Western countries, and usually they support the most unpleasant political forces there are, like the National Front in France, or the in the UK, it's also the far-right groups. And Nick Griffin, who was the head of the neo-fascist British National Party, was one of the quote-unquote European observers in the 2011 State Duma election, which they brought in to counter the real European observers who said that the election was rigged. And of course, these fascists said that the election is perfectly fine and democratic, and much more so than in Great Britain. That's what he said. So I think those methods are something to watch for. And again, I know I keep repeating this, but I think it's really important to counter the propaganda that Putin's putting out by providing objective, real information, including in the Russian language. And I'm very happy that I was actually yesterday at the LTV studios here recording for a program, and we spoke Russian, so it's going to be on LTV7, I think, in Russian, and on LTV1 with Latvian translation over. So they're going to do it for both markets, and I really think this is very important. The question on the militarization, on the aggressive actions that you raised, again, I would say that I think all of this has purely domestic origins and domestic motivations. Whether it is to ratchet up the propaganda machine, because of course they need to keep this appearance that they're the strongest, that Russia is rising up from its knees, that look at those pindose, how would you say that even in English? It's the,
there is no translation.
Right, it's the offensive term they use for Americans. Pindastan, look at them, they're on their knees, we're rising up. They need to back this up with something. So this is why the Iskanders in Kaliningrad. This is why Syria. This is why all these things they're doing. And also some things have literally domestic political considerations, like the aggression against Ukraine that we already talked about tonight. I think the main reason for this aggression in 2014 was not geopolitical or spheres of influence or recreating post-Soviet space or whatever. I think the main reason was purely domestic. Mr. Putin really did not enjoy that TV footage of Yanukovych boarding his helicopter to flee while tens of thousands of people were protesting on the streets of Kiev. That struck too close to home. Because, you know, a democratic Latvia or a democratic Estonia are not really, you know, a direct example for Russian society because we are very different. Ukraine is not very different. We have so much in common. You know, when I hear Ukrainian language, I can understand 80% of it. We're both Orthodox in terms of religion, majority. We have, you know, shared history and culture for many centuries. So if Ukraine overthrows a corrupt authoritarian regime and goes democratic, that's a really bad precedent for Mr. Putin. And I think he went into Ukraine to show, or to pretend to show, that any attempt to get rid of authoritarian and corrupt regimes will lead to chaos, war, bloodshed, even though he is the one who's actually fomenting this chaos and war and bloodshed. But that's what they're doing. And on your question about these reshuffles, I think we see that Mr. Putin is trying to replace, indeed, the old guard, like Ivanov, like Yakunin, like all of these other people that he's slowly replacing with a younger generation of you know, these bureaucrats or ex-KGB people. Or, as you know, Ivanov was replaced as Kremlin chief of staff by Anton Vaino, who's the grandson of the last first secretary of the Estonian Communist Party. And he's a really weird guy, by the way, from what we can read in public. He had this, yeah, he's writing books about some, I'm not even sure I'll be able to, you know,
philosophy,
articulate.
Something between Sambo, which is like Russian fight, and I don't remember other element, but that was interesting.
Anyway, so that's the guy who's now Kremlin chief of staff. But on Kirienko, I think you know, I would just answer very. I can answer this very directly. Don't read this as any kind of sign. Kirienko has been a long time described as any kind of a liberal. He's been a loyal servant of the Putin regime for the last 17 years, and this is, by the way, a continuing problem that people who used to be called liberals and used to be considered liberals, in some cases actually were liberals at one point, like Kirienko, like Chubais, you know, like Kudrin, like others, who've been loyal and effective servants of the Putin regime for many years. For some reason, they're still considered by inertia to be liberals. They're not. We already talked about Boris Nemtsov. He was a liberal. He was a real liberal, and he remained a liberal until the end of his life, regardless of the risks, because he thought that, you know, the whole purpose of being in politics is to defend what you believe in, not to serve any kind of regime with any kind of political face. That certainly cannot be said about Mr. Kirienko.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Karklina?
My question is about the other Russia you mentioned, the opposition. And first of all, would you say a bit more about the group you represent, Open Russia? But more importantly, so many democratic Russians have left Russia. They live abroad. So what are they doing? Are there any specific organized attempts? Do they work on internet? Do they send money? What do they do? Or do they visit? Because one could think that probably they would have the potential, many prominent, very experienced people, they have the potential to be also part of the alternative. So do you see that actively, or what's happening?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question also. The group, I actually represent two groups. I'm the deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party, which was Boris Nemtsov's party, and also the Open Russia movement. So in terms of the party, we are the only political party in today's Russia that was registered despite the Kremlin, not because of it, because we won a case in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg 4 years ago in 2012. Russia is a member of the Council of Europe. As we know, in our highest court of justice still is the European Court of Human Rights, although the Kremlin is trying to ignore it increasingly, but still it's the last vestige of justice we as Russian citizens have, is to go to Strasbourg. And we did this and we won, and so our party was registered by direct order of the European Court of Human Rights back in 2012. And we got the right to participate in the elections because of Boris Nemtsov 3 years ago in 2013, when he won a regional election in Yaroslavl. He won a seat in the regional parliament in Yaroslavl, and by Russian law, a party that is represented in at least one regional parliament can have automatic ballot access. It doesn't need to collect, we don't need to collect signatures to be put on the ballot, because if you collect signatures, that's 100% guarantee you will not be allowed on the ballot. They said there's a comma in the wrong place, there's a misprint, there's this and that, there's a page number missing, goodbye. So those are the two reasons that we actually exist as a legal political party able to participate in elections. And the Open Russia movement, my other hat, it's a pro-democracy movement, pro-democracy platform, was established and is led by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who, as you well know, was for more than 10 years a political prisoner under Putin, has served in prison camps and jails on politically motivated charges from 2003, 2013, before he was exiled abroad, like again in the bad old Soviet times with the dissidents who were sent from prison directly to the West. That's what happened to him in December 2013. He was sent from his prison cell in Karelia to Germany. He is now outside of Russia, but he has founded this movement to serve as a platform for those pro-democracy activists, especially young pro-democracy activists, a new generation. That's his stated goal, again, to begin preparing the future today, the future democratic Russia today. And this is why we put these people up, these young candidates up for election. And in fact, in 2 weeks' time, we will hold an official founding congress of the Open Russia movement. We will hold it in Helsinki because, for obvious reasons, Mr. Khodorkovsky cannot be in Russia now, so that he can attend. We'll hold it in Helsinki, but also it's very, obviously logistically easy and very close. I mean, from St. Petersburg, you just take a car, and even from other places, from Russia, it's very close. So this is where we will meet in 2 weeks' time, and we will structure this movement more formally. By formally, I don't mean any official registration papers. I mean just, to have a clearer structure, clearer set of goals. But we do know for sure that it's going to be a horizontal interregional structure with not a top-down thing, not a vertical in the style of the Kremlin today, but a horizontal structure that depends on the activists in the regions around the country, because that, I think, is the only way for a real democratic movement to go forward, to be democratic not just in name, but in its structure as well. So this is what we're doing and what we plan to be doing in terms of the movements. And the final part of your question?
What about others? So many.
Oh yes, people who left. Right. Sorry, I remember. We talked also about the many parallels with the Soviet regime that we have today, and I often get asked, well, do you think they're going to close the borders as well at some point, like the Soviets did? And I say, no, never, because they're happy that people are leaving. Because what kind of people are leaving? It's people like us, people who are more educated, who are more European-oriented, who are not happy about what's going on, and let them leave from the Kremlin point of view. It's a tragedy for the country because, in my view, these are the best people, and we're losing them. But for Putin, they're happy. They're happy for the most active people to go, let them all go. And this is, by the way, why I think it's important that we should not go. I think the biggest gift we could give to this regime is to just give up and run away. And I don't think we should give them that pleasure. As you may know, there was an attempt on my life last year. I was poisoned, and I'm very fortunate, very happy to be here because it was some kind of a sophisticated binary poison from what it seems. And my wife was told that I had a 5% chance of surviving it. So I'm very happy to be here today. But I remember that, as soon as I woke up from coma, and I knew that once I'd finish medical rehabilitation abroad, I would go back to Russia and resume doing what we're doing. Because again, I think it's the biggest gift we could give Mr. Putin, is to give up and run away, and we're not going to do that. But I think that those people who either have been forced to leave or chose to leave for some reason, I really hope that they will come back when things change, because we will need them. As I said, I think these are some of the best people we have, some of the most active, most educated people now with experience of life in the West, and there are, by the way, many here in all three Baltic states, but including especially Latvia. Actually, one of the independent Russian media outlets, Meduza, is based here in Riga. This is the former Lenta.ru, which was again shut down or taken over 2 years ago. They found a base here in Riga. So we would really hope that these people would come back, just like, you in the Baltic states had only 40 years of communism, unlike us. We had 74 years. That's really actually turned out to be a big difference, because you still had some people in 1991 who remembered what it was like to have an independent Latvia. We had no one, basically, well, maybe, 3 people in 1991 who remember what it was like in 1917. It's a whole world of difference. And as far as I know, there were people who actually, values like you, for example, who lived abroad during Soviet times, but who returned here and who live here now and used, your intellect and your abilities and your resources to help build the independent Latvian state. And we hope that those Russians who, for some reason or other, have left recently, that they will come back, because we will need them, we will need their expertise, we will need their energy, and this is what I hope will happen.
Thank you. So, as soon as your political force was mentioned, I have Levada data about People's Freedoms Party, Parnas. So that was interesting. I'm sorry, yeah. So that was a good question. Which parties are subject to the most administrative pressure and dirty tricks in these elections? Thanks. Yes. So the answer that People Freedoms Party, 5%. So for it's not high percent, but it's like for those answers about other parties or even like small. So that means you are in the front runners. That means people can see that there are dirty tricks against your party. So thank you. And there is a question from Lolo Tchigane.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vladimir, for speaking to us. It's really, really wonderful to listen to you. And I would like to thank you really for your courage and your resilience. This is really wonderful to see.
I'm just stubborn, that's all.
And sometimes, actually, I'm sometimes jokingly saying that if we need some additional dose of optimism and resilience and courage, we should talk to Ukrainians and also now I see Russian opposition. So it gives us a confidence boost, so to say. And I just wanted to ask about these different faces of Russia. I will share a small story about the fact that a year ago there was a group of Russian regional journalists coming to our parliament. They were from Altai region, and we, a few deputies, were asked to meet them and to talk to them. And I was a bit scared because I actually expected a level of aggressiveness and also hostility. But we did not see any of that. We actually had an extremely friendly conversation, and there was a feeling that we are not that different. And after the conversation, some of the people came to me and asked how much would it cost to buy an apartment in Riga. So an interesting insight. You said that you've been traveling around Russia a lot for these elections. What is the face of the Russian regions? I believe for Latvians it's sometimes really hard to imagine to what extent Russia is vast and how many urban centers, apart from Moscow and St. Petersburg, there are. How do people feel there? Is there this completely predominant apathy? And the second question that I wanted to ask you is about depths of censorship. Because obviously you very well described, and we all know that the television is censored, there is little print media that is independent. But how about art and publication? Obviously on history you already talked about that, and we understand that there is strong censorship, probably if not always officially imposed, then some kind of self-censorship. But what is your feeling about the Russian art and theater, cinema? Have they got this message of having to self-censor or already be coming under some censorship pressures? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the very important questions. On your first question about the regions, I probably traveled more around Russia in the last 2 years in this job than I have in my whole previous life. I've really seen many diverse places, and I was actually pleasantly surprised, not unpleasantly, because I also had this stereotype. I'm a Muscovite, third, fourth generation. I also had this stereotype that this is just Moscow and St. Petersburg where people care about such things as democracy, liberalism, European values. All the rest, nobody gives a damn about. That's not true. Everywhere, and I've been to maybe 12 or 14 regions from Kaliningrad to Irkutsk in the last couple of years, and everywhere I go and everywhere we hold events, staged, discussions, meetings, whatever, everywhere there are people, like me, like us, like you just said, who are the same as you, people who think, Russia should be a normal modern European state, everywhere. It's regardless of geography, by the way. I mean, Irkutsk, geographically, it's not in Europe, but it feels absolutely European there. And that was a very pleasant surprise. Actually, since I mentioned Irkutsk, that was what probably struck me the most, in a good way, because it's like some kind of a oasis of free thinking, even today. I mean, they have openly opposition professors in the university, they have active civil society groups, they have a pretty strong independent media, local independent media over there. I don't know whether it's because it's so far out. We say the further from Moscow, the freer you breathe. Maybe it's because of that. But also I think that, maybe it's something to do with the genes of the revolutionaries and the anti-Soviet elements who were exiled there for decades and centuries, since the late 18th century and continuing, until the 1980s. And maybe some of those people who stayed there, and that's their genes at work. But I was really pleasantly surprised, particularly in Irkutsk. But this goes also for other places. I mean, Tatarstan, for instance, is a very restrictive place in terms of the official policies. There are no independent media. Elections have 99.9% results, like in the Soviet times, like in North Caucasus also. But we haven't been doing work in North Caucasus, I have to say. But in Tatarstan, which is very restrictive politically, there were still, and there are still people who are prepared to take part openly in our events, for instance, despite the situation. I mentioned that I took Professor Andrei Zubov there for a lecture. So, of course, all the the buildings, the rooms that we had rented, they all denied. The last one didn't deny, but the police came in and kicked us all out. So we just, we chose a cafe that was open but empty. So we came in and he delivered his lecture without microphone. He has a very loud voice. And we had about maybe 180, 200 people, and not a single person left. They all went with us to the streets, walked down wherever, took those seats at the cafe. After having seen the police, the batons, everything, they were there, and they were there until the end. And they were not afraid of cameras and photos. So that's also my hope. You mentioned the optimism. I think that's a job qualification for us. We can't really do without it. But I'm very happy when I can have some confirmation for this optimism, when I see these people. And on your question about regional journalists, I think actually some of the, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, some of the most active kind of hubs of media independence that remain in Russia are found in the regions, like in Irkutsk, like in just very close to here in the Pskov region, just across the border from you. There's this newspaper called Pskovskaya Gubernia, which is headed by Lev Schlossberg, who's one of the leaders of Yabloko, another liberal party in Russia. And he's a local member of parliament as well in Pskov, and he's the founder and head of this newspaper. And it was this newspaper, by the way, that provided the first definitive proof of involvement by regular Russian military forces in Ukraine in 2014. And for that, Lev Schlossberg was beaten up. He was removed. He was stripped of his parliamentary seat and kicked out of the Legislative Assembly. And a month ago, despite everything we've said about Russian elections, he won his seat back. And I called him on that day and I said, I'm really interested, what were the faces of the people who expelled you a year ago, and now you've been returned there by voters in Pskov, not in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. I want to imagine what their faces are like. He said, their faces are nothing. They don't have this organ that's responsible for conscience. It doesn't work. They just said hi. That's it. But anyway, some of the voices of media independence are in the regions, and I think also that's a very important sign that it's not. We have to go beyond Moscow and Petersburg. Of course, they're always going to be the most important ones. They're the capitals, but we really have to go beyond, especially being such a big country. We can't just do everything in two places.
I'm sorry, time is running out, unfortunately, and
thank you very much. I really enjoyed being here.
I must say that was and is a great privilege to have you here, and probably we would continue with the questions, but so this is time, and I'll give you our souvenir from our think tank, the book Fortress Russia. Political, economic and security development in Russia following the annexation of Crimea and its consequences for the Baltic states. And what is important, there were three Russian authors, it's for you, three Russian authors who we invited. That was Alexander Goltz, Dmitry Oreshkin and Roman Dobrokhotov. And I believe when we are studying Russia, it's good to have Russians on board. So maybe we will ask also you in one of our future projects to take part. So, but really I appreciate that. That was good. Thank you. Yes. See? Yeah. See? Thank you. So you can say you are warm welcome here, so please come more and more to Latvia. So thank you all of you for questions, and there is something for us, yes, and thank you to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for everything we have here, including Mr. Kara-Murza. Let's continue discussions if there were some questions, so there will be time. Thank you.